What are HIPAA security risk assessments and why you need one? My name is Fernando Sosa, and I'll be the presenter for today. I'm the CEO of HaonTech.com. We're an IT consulting company. We provide computer maintenance and network support to private practices. I am a certified HIPAA security professional, a Microsoft certified technology specialist, Microsoft partner, project manager, and software developer. I basically help small businesses with their IT solutions. Worry-Free MD is the webinar series that we put together for MGMA members like you. And today's webinar is going to be about HIPAA security assessment. So here's the agenda for today. Now, this is a 30-minute webinar. It's really quick, and it's not a sales presentation, and it's strictly educational. And I'm going to cover the topic of HIPAA security risk assessment and why you need one. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please ask them. On the upper left, you're going to have a button that says Ask a Question. So if you have any questions at any time, just put it up there, type it in, click on Ask a Question, type it in, and then at the end of the webinar, I am going to go over the questions, any questions that I get as time permits. And so let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'm going to talk about these points here. So first one is, what is a risk assessment? So I'm going to basically go over in general, what is a risk assessment? What are the benefits for your organization to have a risk assessment? There are benefits, not just HIPAA-related requirements, but as a business, there are benefits of having of conducting a risk assessment. And what are the components of a risk assessment? Risk assessments can be done in many different ways, but typically based on the HIPAA requirements, there are certain components that need to be on any assessment. So I'm going to touch on that. And then I'm going to share with you a security risk assessment tool that was offered, that's made available by HHS earlier this year. And many people don't know about this tool, and it's a good tool. It's something available, better something better than nothing. And I'm going to share that with you. And then we're going to end with a Q&A. Well, I'll go with try to answer any questions that I have here and see how much time we have left after that. So what is a risk assessment? So in essence, without getting into too much, a risk assessment is, the essence of it is basically one way for your organization to cover all your bases in terms of how secure your information is, how well protected your PHI is. That's the essence of the risk assessment. So HIPAA requires that to cover entities in order to make sure that it's not just assume that everybody's protecting their information, but they give you the guidelines of what you need to check, what questions you need to ask, and cover. It's a very thorough process to have a risk assessment done. Many questions are raised and even uncovered when you go through an assessment. And so the sole purpose of it is to determine the risks, the potential vulnerabilities that you have, the security holes, the privacy issues, all of that is basically we try to uncover them in a risk assessment, and then you're going to determine what you need to do to address the findings. So that's the essence of it. On this slide, I'm saying it's required. All PHI, the HIPAA security rule requires every covered entity to protect their PHI and to do a risk assessment. It's the first step in assuring HIPAA compliance, is to have a risk assessment done. So, like I said, it's a very thorough process, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. But the basic thing that you want to understand is that this is a requirement. It's not optional in order to be HIPAA compliant. And there's other benefits that, not just in terms of HIPAA, but there's also other benefits in terms of meaningful use and just common business practice. There's benefits in that. So again, it's required, and it's something that you need to do in order to be HIPAA compliant. That's one of the things that you're going to have to prove that you've done. If you ever are audited, or if somebody raises a complaint, the first question that's going to come up is the risk assessment, and then the risk assessment has many questions to cover in terms of how your practice is protecting your PHI in different areas. So in this slide, I'm going to talk to you about, okay, the benefits. Okay, so like I said, it's the first step in HIPAA compliance to have an assessment done. And when you're, as a business, forget about HIPAA, but if you, as a business, know or learn where are your threats, where are your business is weak in terms of security, that in itself is a huge business positive. It's a benefit, because then you can uncover these threats and you can patch them. You can fix them. So again, it's kind of a requirement. It is a requirement, but it's also something positive that you can get as a business. So in terms of business, just purely business sense, it's a good practice to do an assessment, a security assessment. Now, in terms of HIPAA, it's a requirement. So the idea is to uncover your risk, either lower the risk, mitigate the risk, or eliminate the risk. Now, it's impossible to eliminate 100% the risk. So any risk assessment that you do, it's not likely that you're going to be 100% covering everything, but it's much better than not doing the assessment. So in terms of business sense, it definitely makes sense to do that. Now, the components of a risk analysis. Now, before I get into this, there's some terms that are interchangeable. When you hear risk analysis, risk assessment, security risk analysis, HIPAA, those are terms that you're going to hear over and over, and they're used interchangeably, but they're talking about the same thing when it comes to HIPAA. So you'll hear the term HIPAA risk analysis, HIPAA risk assessment, HIPAA security risk assessment. We're talking about the same thing. Now, like I said, HIPAA does not give you a requirement and tells you exactly how to do a risk assessment. They tell you that you need to do a risk assessment, and basically that opens up the topic and the conversation to do an assessment, but they don't tell you exactly what you need to do, what every entity needs to do. It's complicated because every entity has different setups, large, small, so there's no one way to do a risk assessment. There's many ways to do it, but HIPAA does give you some components that are required. And here on this screen I have the components that any risk assessment, any risk analysis needs to have. And again, it's high level. Like most of the items in HIPAA, it's high level, so they don't get into specifics, into details, into the actual implementation, but the components is this. The first thing is the scope of the analysis. When you're doing when a risk analysis is done, you want to cover every single area where there is PHI, either created, maintained, transmitted. Many times people tend to think that PHI only exists in the EMR. But in reality, and when you go through the risk analysis and follow the questions that are in the risk analysis, you're going to uncover that PHI actually exists in many other areas in your office. It could be in your copier, it could be in your printer, it could be in your fax, it could be in an email, it could be in bits and pieces and traces of PHI can reside in your network, on your network. And the scope analysis of the risk assessment is gonna cover that, and you're gonna uncover it and find out where there's a risk. And so it's not just the EMR, it's more than that. Now, the data collection, once you complete the risk analysis, or as you're doing the risk analysis, everything has to be documented properly. And there's a way to document all of this information. And then with all the documentation, you're going to identify what are the potential threats and vulnerabilities. So as you're finding all this PHI scattered and as you're documenting it, you still need to document it. You can't pass judgment while you're documenting it. You still have to document it, and then you want to identify everything that you've documented. You want to identify the potential, which ones are potential threats, how likely are they to occur, and the risk analysis has some guidelines in terms of how do you grade it into how likelihood, high, low, medium, and you can make sort of like a matrix and determine the likelihood of threats and vulnerabilities. So then it goes into another component is you want to assess your current security measures. So you may have and you should have the current security measures in place. So the risk assessment is going to assess what you have right now in place and determine if you have in fact some areas of weakness where you have some risk and some potential threats that you have to or could address or make better. The next component of the risk analysis is that you're going to determine the likelihood of threat occurrence. Now, let me pause for a moment as I go through this. And I said before, the risk analysis is not something that is ideally done by the covered entity. It's very, very comprehensive. Many questions. It's not something that you can do in a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, maybe not even a couple of days. It really depends on your setup. But it's definitely something that is time-consuming, and it's typically done by a third party, ideally an IT provider that is HIPAA certified or someone that has experience doing HIPAA risk assessment. In theory, anybody could do it if you're thorough enough and spend enough time. You're probably going to spend more time than somebody who knows. But these are, so just going back to this, number 5, it says determine the likelihood of threat occurrence. And then again, you're going to document that, and there's a way to document how likely your threat is. Then you're going to determine the potential impact of threat occurrence. Okay, so it's not enough just to determine the likelihood, but you also want to be prepared. If you do get a threat, if it does occur, you want to know beforehand, or at least you want to make the assessment and know beforehand what is the impact, what is the potential impact if you do have a threat. So again, and it walks you through, the assessment walks you through those questions. And again, just coming back and thinking as a business, this is very valuable information for you to know as a business. If something happens, emergency preparedness, you'll know at least how it affects you and how it will impact you. So that's one of the components of the risk analysis, is to determine the impact. Now, another component which kind of seems similar is determine the level of risk. Again, you're not going to eliminate 100% of your risk. You're not going to, but you're going to strive to lower all the risks that you uncover. And the end result is that you're going to have a better picture of your risks that you have in your organization, and you can determine which ones and prioritize them and mitigate them and see which ones can be lowered and which ones are not as critical. Then you finalize the documentation. You have everything, your risk analysis in one nice big comprehensive document, and that is something that you're going to keep in your office. And not only this is not something that's just done once. HIPAA requires that you do this on an ongoing basis. Now, how ongoing, how much, they don't tell you exactly how many times you need to do it. Again, because it really depends on your office, on your size, on the complexity of your environment. But they do say it has to be done on a regular basis. So that changes on a case-by-case basis. Typically, it's done once a year, every 6 months, at least once a year. It's safe. It's safe to do. And this is the first step, the first thing that comes up if there's ever a breach or a complaint. And HHS is going to ask, the first question that they're going to ask is whether you have the risk assessment or risk analysis done. And again, in terms of meaningful use, it's one of the requirements. Now, one thing that I want to share with you is that there is HHS put out earlier this year a security risk assessment tool. And this is a tool that they provided for small practices or anybody to use it so they can help them do this risk assessment or collect the data that is collected when you're doing the risk assessment. So it gives you step-by-step questions to fill out, and you enter the data based on the question that they ask. Again, it's not something that you sit down and just do right away. It's going to involve, typically it requires you to have different people in your organization participate in the questionnaire. So whenever a risk assessment is done in your office, you're going to have to provide some time for different staff members to answer some questions. Probably going to be more than one person that's going to be involved in the questionnaire. So this tool is something you can look at. Again, I don't recommend that a covered entity does this themselves. It is available if you want to do it, but it is a comprehensive risk assessment, a comprehensive task to do a risk assessment. This tool helps you do that. I'm going to provide you a link to that at the end of the webinar. You can I'll send it to you, and you can take a look at that. There's this tool does not guarantee HIPAA compliance, by the way. They do make it available, but they don't guarantee that just because you're using the tool, it's a guaranteed HIPAA compliance. It's just one of many tools out there. There's no one method of doing a risk assessment. Like I said, HIPAA does not tell you one method. There's many methods, and based on your situation, the methodology of the risk assessment can be different. So you kind of have to adapt the assessment based on your scenario. So this is the risk assessment tool. Let me just remind you, if you have any questions at any point during the webinar, please go ahead and type it in on the upper left. There's an Ask a Question button. You can click on that and then type your question and submit it, and then I'll get to it at the end. Okay, so this is the security risk assessment tool. Many people don't know about this yet. I don't know if it just hasn't been advertised as such, but it's available there. I'll show you where to get that. Okay, so I'm going to end with this slide that I typically end in the previous webinars, and it's just an example of data breaches that have occurred. It's public information taken from the HHS website. I always highlight the one in yellow here because it just indicates how important it is for small practices to pay attention. This is the one in yellow is a small nonprofit hospice in North Idaho, which settled a HIPAA violation in the case for $50,000, and it involved less than 500 patients. So involving less than 500 patients just brings to light that small practices are being noticed by HHS. So you really have to step up and make sure your HIPAA compliance is you're up to date, and security risk assessment is your first step in becoming HIPAA compliant. I'm going to open it up. Again, this is a quick webinar to introduce you on what is a risk assessment and why you need one. Now, I addressed what is a risk assessment. Basically, again, just to reiterate, it's really a huge questionnaire. It guides you through all your technology. Oh, one thing, by the way, the risk assessment or being HIPAA compliant is not just about technology. It involves mainly three areas, according to HIPAA: the administrative, the physical, and the technical. So you have to have safeguards in those three areas. Technology is one area. Now, typically I hear people mention HIPAA security or HIPAA compliance, and they only focus on their IT. And in reality, the greater part of being HIPAA compliant falls in the administrative safeguards. Now, when you're doing a risk analysis, a risk assessment, that covers all these three areas. So a thorough risk analysis is going to help you make sure that you are covering the administrative safeguards, the physical safeguards, and the technical safeguards. So it's not just technology. Now, like I said, the administrative it falls more like in terms of policies and procedures that you have in place. If you have a compliance officer. So those are the kind of things that you have to look at. The physical has more to do with the physical security of a building, your infrastructure, your computers, the actual physical, how secure your office is. And then the technical is obviously your IT. So again, the risk assessment has a lot of questions that cover all of these areas, and it's very thorough. It's very thorough. So it can take you a couple of hours or days just to do a risk assessment. So let me go over the questions. I have my contact information on the screen. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email, and I'll send you a link, a couple of links with resources that I mentioned in this webinar. There's the website and my phone number. Again, my name is Fernando Sosa. Thank you very much. I'm going to look at some questions I have here. Okay, one question. What is the expected cost for a security risk assessment for a surgical practice of 4 physicians? Okay. One thing that I can tell you, the cost of not having an assessment, if you get into a breach, it's going to be much higher than having a risk assessment done. So there is a cost associated with having a risk assessment done, but in terms of having your office properly secured in the 3 areas, in terms of administrative, physical, and technical, that's a huge business benefit. And in terms of being HIPAA compliant, that's a huge, it's a requirement. So I can't really get into cost in the webinar, but if you send me an email, we can have a more custom conversation. I can give you a better idea in terms of cost. Another question here is, does the security tool guarantee compliance? No. Like I said, the security tool is just a tool. There are many tools out there that each provider, each person who does an assessment will have its own tool. Some of them will just have can use this tool. Some of them can use like a spreadsheet where it's all a matter of having all the questions answered and going through all the questions and going through your whole office network and all your policies and procedures and all of that. So there's no one way of doing it. So HIPAA, HHS doesn't guarantee HIPAA compliance just because you use the tool. It does help you if you don't have anything to start with. But again, if you go to somebody who does this, you don't need to worry about this tool. This tool, maybe somebody will use that tool, but I'm just letting you know about it because it's on the HHS website. I have a question here that I'm not sure about. A compliance officer. Is this the job of a compliance officer? Is the security assessment of the responsibility of a compliance officer? Anybody can. There's no assigned person that needs to do the risk assessment. The compliance officer does have responsibility. You have to have, first of all, you have to have a compliance officer. That's part of the requirement, and that goes into in the risk assessment. It'll ask you that question: who's the assigned compliance officer? So to answer your question, no, this is not really the role of the compliance officer to do the risk assessment. The compliance officer does have a role in risk management, meaning that throughout the roles and day-to-day activities, just to make sure everything is maintained and everything does follow compliance. So the actual assessment itself can be done by any third party, IT provider, HIPAA expert, yeah. So ideally, it will be somebody outside of the office that will do this, the risk assessment. If people have any other question here, any other question, feel free to jump in. There's one question, what's the difference between addressable and required? Okay, that's a good point. I'm not sure if I mentioned it. So when you're doing when the risk assessment is being done, some items, some rules HIPAA rules are required, and some rules are addressable. And so there's a difference between what is addressable, what is required, what is optional. Something that is addressable is not optional. If one of the questions asked in the risk assessment is addressable, it needs to be documented. So, for example, access authorization. If like one of the administrative safeguards is, do people log in? Is there a login screen on the computers, or is there a login, or is there a key? Well, that will be a physical. If your office is locked with a lock, with a key, that's an example of an addressable rule. So you have to say yes or no, and if you don't have it, you have to explain why. So some things you may choose based on your risk, and that's why it's not set in stone that everybody has to do certain things. It really depends on your situation. Some things you have to say, oh yeah, I know about this, and I have to document it, why I'm choosing not to do it. Those are the addressables. So when the risk analysis is done, some questions are addressable, and you have to say, okay, I'm not implementing this, but this is the reason why. So those are the addressables. Some other rules are required, some that you just have to do. And so that's the difference. And then some of them are optional that you just don't do. Okay? So that's a very good question. Now, let me see. Okay, that's pretty much it. I don't have any other questions. I think, yeah. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Anybody has any other questions? Feel free to type it in. Risk assessment. Have you done your risk assessment? How often you do your risk assessment? Who did your risk assessment? Those are questions that you have to ask yourself, and why you need it, and the benefits that you have just for doing that. Okay, so we're coming up to the half-an-hour mark, and we have 2 more minutes. I don't have any other questions. So anybody have any other questions before we jump off? All right, so feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions. Send me an email, and I'll email you the link to these resources, the security tool, some other document that's on the HHS site, and we can continue the conversation. The next webinar is coming up next week. So again, my name is Fernando Sosa. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. Hope to see you in the next one.